a moment and say hello?
Hi guys, I'm Olivia. I've been working with the education department and for this program with Curatorial to get some awesome live programs out regarding stuff about the museum and other fun nature and science focused workshops as well. So thank you guys all for coming.
Hi, I'm Victoria. I've been at the museum for about a year now. I was an intern during the summer and I started in the fall full time. I work closely with Laura doing research, and I work with our registrar handling objects. And yeah, I'm very excited to see this talk. And leave any questions in the comments and in the chat, and I will make sure Laura sees them.
Yeah, actually, Olivia, if you go to the next slide, that basically tells people that.
Laura, are you ready to start
Sure.
your presentation? Okay.
Sure.
All right.
Okay, so this is called Women's Clothing from the Glenview Era. And if you go to the next slide, that just gives some tips for watching the live tour.
Okay.
So we just tell people it's going to be, we have 83 people on the call, which is great. So if you would mute your audio, that's helpful to keep there from being background noise while I'm talking. And just to be aware that your video is probably on by default. If you'd rather your video not be on, you could turn it off. And just keep asking questions or comments, and we're going to pause halfway through and at the end. So if you want to go to the next slide, Olivia. I just want to give people a little bit of an overview because we are going to be talking about costumes today that would have been worn by the Trevor family at Glenview. But in case some of you have never been to the museum, this is Glenview, the historic home built by John Bon Trevor in 1876, and the family moved in 1877. On the left is a photograph of Glenview in relatively the current day, taken in the year 2000 from our courtyard. And on the right, the Trevor family actually had Edward Bierstadt, the brother of Hudson River School painter Albert Bierstadt, photograph the house inside and out in the 1880s. And that is one of those photographs. Next slide. So to give you a little bit of idea inside the house, what the interiors look like, we call this Eastlake Style. It was heavily influenced by designs coming over from England and even influences from Japan, both of which people were picking up at the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia that year. And actually the subject of my next talk in June is going to be the woodwork inside the house. Next slide, please. So in the last slide, that was the entrance hall and the library. And then another room that the Trevor women would spend a lot of time in when they were entertaining is our parlor, which is restored in the color picture. You see it restored today. And then on the upper left is a picture that we used from that set of photographs by Edward Bierstadt to guide our restoration of that room. And then the next slide is a current view of our dining room. With a really, just happens to be the pictures that I have to show you are with it elaborately decorated by Deborah Blair, our trustee, who's an interior designer at during the holidays. And if you look on the left, you can see how the house is set up, where when the pocket doors are open, you can look all the way down the house through the sitting room and into the library. So, and then the next slide, which I mean to be surprising. Okay, so this is why I want to talk about costumes in Glenview, and not just because in Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon, they have on no clothes because it's a painting of prostitutes. But I had to write a paper on this painting in college, and I learned a lot about it, but I didn't really have a full understanding of how revolutionary and shocking this painting would have been until I started working at the museum and studying historic costumes and realized this, which, next slide, that the women who came to look at this painting in 1907 would have been dressed like this. And suddenly it helped me imagine myself in that time and in that place and realizing just how shocking that painting would have been. And so I like to think about that a lot when I think about the relationship between art and decorative art and costumes, that they can help us understand different media in different ways.
Yeah, I got it.
Hello. So I think we missed a slide. Okay. So another reason, more directly related to Glenview, that I started thinking a lot about the costumes worn by the Trevor women is I once got a question on a tour in this space, the library. I was asked if there was room, the way the furniture was set up, for women to move around with their hoop skirts. And the truth is that there were never any hoop skirts at Glenview. So when you think about the space and you want to think about imagining yourself in the kind of outfits that you would have on when you walked around through
Alt
Glenview,
A.
Someone has their audio on. But you could imagine yourself walking around in the spaces in Glenview at the time. That's not what they would have had on. They would not have on the giant hoop skirts you see here that were popular in the late 1850s and 1860s, because that was before Glenview was built. So next slide. Now, Glenview was lived in for a lot of years. The Trevors moved in 1877, and Mrs. Trevor died in 1922. So obviously, it would be more than an hour for me to tell you every little thing about changes in fashion during those times. But I do want us to think about just even looking at these two outfits, which did not belong to the Trevors. They're in the museum's collection. The one on the left from the mid 1870s, just around the time or a little before the Trevors moved into Glenview, a very elaborate outfit. If you could see it from the side, I think I have another picture in a minute. There's a bit of a bustle on the back. It's not even just a two-piece, it's a four-piece dress. It's got extra pieces that go on to make that sort of apron effect to the skirt. And then by nearing the end of the time that Trevors are living in Glenview, we have this evening gown from about 1912, very straight, much looser, less shaping of the waist, and heavily influenced by the bright colors and the exoticism of Parisian fashions, which were in turn influenced by the ballet russe. So that's the range of costumes that the Trevor women were wearing. Could we have the next slide, please? So we're going to start with the 1870s, and in the next slide, actually, I do have another picture of that 1870s dress from the side. So next slide. So you can see this bustle. And again, to show you just how typical this look is around 1875 to the early years of Glenview, this woman who is probably a Yonkers woman, but not one of the Trevors, has on a dress with a bodice almost identical to the one in the museum's collection, with a big bow and then these kind of ruffles that are accentuating the shoulders. And take a look at these shoulders. They're a little bit, have a dropped effect by the way the detail is on there. A lot of the buttons, it's hard to talk about tiny details like this, but a lot of times the buttons on these dresses are covered with crochet. And in this case, it matches the bow. And then in this fashion plate, again, you see there's a bustle effect, but a lot of times, rather than being very rigid and smoothly outlined, it's created by a lot of flounces and ruffles and ribbons. It's a very elaborate look, but particularly to the skirt. The sleeves are fairly simple. And you have a kind of a small top and a large skirt. And then you see how the hats also are sort of very tiny and small. And so is the parasol, all to keep that in balance. Could we have the next slide, please? So I just want to remind us that we're tying this into the Trevors, who were in Yonkers, but also spent a lot of time in New York City. And so a lot of times, you know, some of the things we're going to be looking at to talk about fashion are paintings, are fashion plates, like on the upper left. These would be in fashion magazines of the time, a lot of times Parisian fashions that Americans were looking at. And then we'll also be looking at some photographs of the Trevors and other people from the period. So this is a painting in our collection of Union Square in New York City, and the Trevors would have spent a lot of time right here because in the background is a hotel they would stay at sometimes in the winter. And you just see how the women on the right have on a similar sort of silhouette of dress around this time as these women on the upper left. And even though they're walking around outside with their parasols to, you know, protect their skin, that's why it's called parasol, is for the sun, as opposed to the word umbrella. So it's to protect you.
You hear that?
In the sunshine, not in the rain. And even though they're walking around outside near a seashore, they have on trains. So just keep that in mind. Also, an interesting detail of the painting, down underneath them, you see a woman with a carriage. We'll be talking more today about the fashions worn by wealthier people like the Trevors. They are often better documented and they are better preserved because they weren't worn out the way a working woman's clothing would be. But that woman, because she's wearing a cap and an apron, is probably a nanny. Could we have the next slide, please? All right, so getting back to time spent by the Trevors up at Glenview, which to them was the country. It was really, Yonkers is a misnomer to call it just a bedroom community because it was a city. It had become incorporated as a city in 1872 and it had a huge industrial base. But people like the Trevors who lived by the river in the northern parts of the city definitely considered themselves to be up in the country. And the Trevors had 23 acres on the river. And when they would go there, when Emily was older in her diary, she would write that she was going to the country. And here are daughters Mary and Emily in two different pictures. On the left, you see them in their outfits. They seem to be maybe 7 and 5. And then on the right, they're a little bit older. And, you know, in the estate at Glenview, they could go around in their horse cart. And she would write about this in her diary a lot, that she was out driving the horses with her mother. Sometimes this is with a family friend. Next slide. And next slide. So we start to know a little bit more about the Trevors in the 1880s. This is really the first heyday of them living at Glenview. And so if you think back at that slide I showed of the library and the fact that people weren't in hoop skirts, as a matter of fact, during the early years of Glenview, was really the narrowest possible silhouette of the Victorian age. And one thing, again, that you start to see, and I mentioned in the description, lobster tails, and a lot of times this kind of drooped bustle that's not even really a bustle anymore, this train effect at the back, people have called that a lobster tail effect. And you also have, if you see this woman on the right is Serra Williams. She grew up in Irvington and later lived in Yonkers, and she's got on a perfect example of this type of dress. It's very form-fitting. They would call the bodice actually a cuirass bodice, Cuirasse, I think that is. And it comes from a term of armor. So it's almost like you are in an exterior corset. It's very smooth, it's very long fitting. And then you have these fashions, and this is one of my favorite periods of the 19th century, are marked by a lot of asymmetry, a lot of details that don't really make a lot of sense as far as the draperies going. It's been described as that the woman looked upholstered, that it's almost like you just have these things kind of applied. It's not like you imagine a skirt that you've pulled up and tacked, or in some ways it looks like that. In other ways, it just looks like they're applying all these kinds of decorations all over it. And then in the fashion plate, you see a fashion on a young girl, and it's sort of a modified version of what the grown-ups are wearing. And look at their hats. You also sort of have these drooping ribbons coming off the back of them, sort of mirroring the trains. And the hats are also, again, very tall because it's a very, very rigidly erect kind of posture. And I just love this magazine cover on the left from Demarest's magazine. Is one of the kinds of magazines that would reprint these fashion plates for people to look at. But the whole effect here too is filled with asymmetry, with influence of Japanese design, and looks very appropriate for Glenview. Why don't we have the next slide? We don't have a lot of photographs of the Trevors from this period, but the Trevor family was able to provide me with a couple. The main picture here is not taken at Glenview. The Trevors were on vacation, I think at Saratoga Springs. But you see, it's a really good example of Mrs. Trevor, second from the left, and she is wearing a very typical outfit that we saw in the previous fashion plate. Very fitted bodice, very narrow sleeves, and then next to her is a sort of a teenaged, or about or preteen or teenage Mary. With her hair still left long, because girls would wear their hair long until they were considered to be young women, and then they would have to wear their hair up. And then leaning on the extreme right is Mr. Trevor, looking very dapper with some watch chains and a bowler hat. And to his right, you see Emily's head, and the little boy with the giant hat on is John Trevor, the son. And then we have another picture of Mary in a winter coat and hat and a muff. And you see very similar lines, narrow sleeves, a lot of sort of decoration of like bows at the neck, and a very fitted bodice. Next picture. Again, we're moving a little bit toward the bustle again, but when the bustle comes back in the 1880s, it's much more structured looking, and there's starts to be less of that really sort of fluffy ribbons and bows and poofs that you saw on the skirts in the 1870s. This slide on the left, and it's a very old slide, I apologize for that, but costumes are very difficult to get out in photographs. So sometimes if you do have a photograph to use, it might be one that was taken quite a long time ago. But this is a lace dress in the museum's collection, and it shows that very exaggerated silhouette of the bustle at the back. And then again, in this fashion plate on the right, you see how the little girls, even though they have on short skirts, they have a very similar silhouette with these little miniature bustles at the back of their short skirts. So if we could have the next slide, please. So this is a painting at the Art Institute of Chicago by George Serra, which holds, I have a lot of memories of seeing this painting when I was a child. And, you know, it shows how knowing a little bit about the actual costumes can help you understand the art you're looking at, and vice versa. So here are some people outdoors enjoying the sunshine in Paris, or I think it's in Paris. And they look very upright, very rigid, very controlled. And you might think, if you only saw the painting, that that is just the style of the artist. But then when you start looking at some of these actual costumes, including the fashion plate that is on the upper left, you see that that is really exactly how they looked. And the only concession really to being outside at the park is that they are wearing hats, carrying parasols, and the trains, you saw those long sort of lobster tails that were coming off the back of the dresses in the 1870s. These women are wearing skirts that are appropriately short, not to, you know, drag along on the grass. You see their feet sticking out in the Godey's Ladies Book fashion plate. Another thing to think about, though, is to see the women that are seated on the grass and see how straight up they are still sitting. And that we will talk about in the next slide. Next slide, please. Oh, so one of the things, the reason the women are sitting up so straight in those dresses are their corsets. And, you know, the dresses themselves were boned too, but everyone had on a corset, and those corsets were fairly long lined onto the hips. Now, there's a lot of different kinds of research and ideas about corsets. Some people saw them as very restrictive and even dangerous. Most of the research I've read currently is that yes, you might lace yourself tightly, although etiquette books advised and health books advised against it. But the corset also was your, you know, in the old days, they would call, you know, girdles and bras foundations. You know, the corset was the foundation for your outfit. There was no such thing as a bra in the 19th century. And the corset was always also serving that purpose of having a bra. And it also helped support the weight of all the petticoats and skirts on your hips. But in that corset, whether or not it was medically unsafely tightly, you know, laced, even if it was just on at a normal tightness, you couldn't really bend. And so it was considered proper for ladies to sit up very straight like that, but also you couldn't really bend. And so the reason I show this slide is that the chair that you see in the center of both pictures is a chair that was at Glenview. That's another one of those Bierstadt photographs, and it's a recliner. So, you know, we don't attempt to recline it today. That wouldn't be safe for the historic chair, which you see restored in the modern picture. But there's little buttons inside of the arms, and it would have reclined. And I always call it Mr. Trevor's recliner because, truthfully, in your corset, you would be hard pressed to recline. And it would also not really be considered appropriate. Reclining was something, you know, relaxed postures like Mr. Trevor sort of leaning back here and crossing his legs. This is a photo portrait of John von Trevor around the time he got married to Mrs. Trevor. you could lean back like that and it was considered appropriate. Or if you were an invalid, or if you were older and perhaps, convalescing and not wearing corsets, you might be reclined, but not if you were a proper lady in your everyday routine. Next slide, please. And so this is just one of my favorite ads I found in Demarest magazine for corsets. And talking about how the corsets of this company, the Wilsonia magnetic corset, is going to help you with sleeplessness, nervousness, general debility, indigestion, rheumatism, and paralysis, which seems a little much, but I love this ad. Health is wealth, it says. And then the corset on the left actually belonged to Mary Trevor. And that is one of her corsets. And you see the little hook near the front closure near her waist, and that would be something that you could sort of attach a skirt to, or help hold down your bodice so it stayed in position. So it's really a very pragmatic, can be a very pragmatic foundational garment. This one is probably got whalebone or some other kind of material in it. A lot of times when they were metal stays, you'll see that they've rusted and left the corset not in very good condition because people would sweat in them, and then the iron stays would rust. Next slide, please. Now, I mentioned before that that the bodices themselves were boned and structured almost like corsets. And this was partly to create the smooth lines that they wanted it to have. And also you see in this one, which is made by a woman dressmaker named Elise Stouffer, who was in New York City. This particular garment did not belong to the Trevors. It's one of the other garments in our collection. This boning got more restrictive and more extreme before it got better. So if you look at the inside of a dress, say from the 1860s, you might see 6 or 7 bones. And then I believe I've counted up to almost 14 in a dress from the 1890s. And also what you're seeing under the armpits are pads, because it was not very easy to wash a silk or wool garment. And besides the fact that you had on layers of chemises and corset covers and other kinds of things to protect your expensive clothing from the fact that you might be sweltering, they would also put underarm pads in them. Next slide, please. So one of the things I wanted us to think about, particularly since the Trevor family was, as I said, up in the countryside at Glenview, is different kinds of outfits that you would wear. And this was true in general for women in the 19th century, particularly wealthy women. You might get up in the morning and have one type of thing on, like this lady's house jacket that you see on the left in this fashion plate. And then you might put on something else if you were going to go out in your carriage and pay visits. You might have on a different kind of outfit if you were going to be, as they called, at home and somebody was going to come visit you. And then you might put on another sort of dress, a little fancier, for dinner. Or if you were going out to the opera, you would put on yet a different sort of dress, or a ball might be a different sort of dress than an opera. And then, as I mentioned, if you were up in Glenview at the countryside, women started doing more activities outdoors. So in this fashion plate, you see someone dressed for tennis, or maybe it's a sort of a badminton, but I love it that she has on this apron that has a big pocket for the balls or the birds if it's badminton. But so that's a practical. And again, look at the length. The length is well above what would drag on the ground. So to us in the 21st century, it just seems horrible that they're out there in long sleeves and long skirts. But at least, you know, there are some concessions being made compared to fashions before that. This is specifically made for activity outdoors. And then the other woman is going to play croquet, which was another outdoor sport that would have been perfect for somewhere like Glenview, which, you know, and they have bonnets on and they're fairly wide brimmed to protect their faces. So next slide, please. So let's get into the 1890s. And in the 1890s is a period where we really know the most about life at Glenview because the younger daughter, Emily Trevor, who never married and lived with her mother there until 1922, kept two diaries, one when she was in her early 20s and one when she was in her early 30s. So early 1890s and early 1900s. And so we start to know a lot more about the kinds of things she would be doing at Glenview and how often she would go into the city to do cultural things like go to the opera. Even when she was staying out at Glenview, she would go back and forth on the train. And so in the 1890s, just to give you a sense of how much the silhouette changed over time, in these fashion plates, first coming off the 1880s, you still have a little bit of a bustle in these first two dresses, but then you start to have sort of this directly upward poof at the top of the shoulder. The shoulders are very much set exactly at your shoulder, not sort of drooping off, as I pointed out in the 1870s. There were some ruffles and other things that gave the effect of the dress falling off the shoulders. And I think if any of you have watched like Victoria or any of these costume dramas set like in the 1840s and 50s, you've particularly have seen that effect of a dress sort of falling off the edges of the shoulders. And then as you move on to the mid 1890s, you see one of the most classic shapes people associate with the Victorian age, which is this hourglass figure with these giant balloon sleeves. They're also called gigot sleeves, Lego mutton sleeves. And so, you know, we think about how we make fun of in the 1980s, everybody had on the shoulder pads to have the big shouldered look. That was nothing compared to the 1890s and this effect of these gigantic sleeves, which was sort of, and look how the hat is now sort of spreading out. And yes, those are probably on that hat in the fashion plate, actual preserved bird wings. I'm not showing it today, but we do from the early 20th century have a hat in the museum's collection that has like an entire bird's wing on it. And it's also spreading outward to echo the shape of the sleeves, and then so does the skirt. And look at how all the attention now is on what's going on the bodice. And the skirt, at least in this walking dress, is perfectly plain, just a wide gored skirt. Then towards the end of the 1890s, you have the sleeves starting to shrink up again, but still have a little bit of gathering at the top. And then the skirt is still full, but it sort of goes down tighter and then flares out more below. Sometimes people call this a tulip shape to the skirt. Next slide, please. This I just thought is fun. This is something actually Victoria's been researching lately. We have this paper doll set in the museum's collection. It was actually some kind of a promotional for a corset. That's why I show you the back of the paper doll. Herculine was the name of the stays, and the prima donna corset is the ad. And then there's a number of outfits. And you can see it's from the 1890s with these big sleeves that the woman has on. And I like it that they give these dolls, you know, people talk about toys for children and whether or not they reinforce stereotypes of gender. And so here, one of the dresses that the paper doll can put on shows that she's going to become a mother. And probably this outfit that she's wearing is something that is more like a tea gown that's a little looser, because maybe if she just had a baby, she's at home and she might not have on her regular corset. Next slide, please. And then these are more of the paper doll fashions. And I just wanted to point out these particular ones. Here it shows that she's going to have a parasol if she goes outside. So this would be for taking a walk outside, and you definitely want to protect your son with your face with the parasol. But look how larger it is now. And, you know, I think that's less about practicality and more about the fact that the silhouette is very wide in the shoulders, and the parasol is widening to reflect that. Again, we have someone that might be going to play tennis here in the middle. And then on the right, a bathing suit. And so complete with stockings, because you wouldn't want to show any bare skin. And even though the sleeves are short, you still have that very puffed sleeve look. So this was something that you might wear to the beach. Next slide, please. So this is the last slide before I'll pause for any questions. And I just wanted to introduce some photographs of who were these Trevor women that we're talking about. Because also when you get into the 1890s, the household really was a household of women. Mr. Trevor died in 1890. And so Mrs. Trevor was running the household, and both of the daughters were getting into their early 20s. John Trevor, the son, was a teenager. And so you had Mrs. Trevor, Emily Norwood Trevor. The elder daughter, Mary Talmadge Trevor Winthrop, she would get married by 1892 and live in the city, and also up in Lenox, Massachusetts. And then Emily Howell Trevor, who wrote the diaries, is on the right. And so I think probably you can see from the sleeve effects here on these dresses, definitely these are pictures from the 1890s at various points, one or another. So if you go to the next slide, Olivia, we could ask Victoria if there have been any questions.
Actually, perfect timing. There was just one that came by. Sandy would like to know, the corset ad from the 1870s mentioned plates. And she was wondering if you could talk a bit about that. So maybe Olivia, if you can get back to that.
I'm looking at it. Cleats?
Plates. Plates.
Is that back where further, do you remember what slide number that was?
I thought that was the only, oh, you mean the ad on the back of the paper doll?
From the 1870s. So I think that first one.
Yeah, I think that's 1880s, but let me go back to it. This one? I'm not sure what that would mean by plates.
We're wondering if potentially it might be fashion plates.
Oh, right. Fashion plate. Yes, I don't know if it was a corset ad. It's just like, you know, it's an old fashioned term you hear today too, or maybe like back in the day when it was harder to have color pictures in a book because they would be printed differently and on different paper, and they would call them the plates. I think plates like a printing plate. And so, so the black and white pictures like this one and some of the other fashion pictures that are just black and white, those are the kind of engravings that can just be printed with the text. And most of the pictures you would see in magazines would be black and white ones like this, because at the time, if they wanted to include a color one like this, it would either be printed in a different way, and it would be like even on a different paper, and they would bind it in with the periodical as a color plate, or they would sometimes actually hand tint them So any other questions, Victoria?
Yes. So let's see. There was wonder if the fashion would be the same in California as it was here in New York.
Wow. I think that would probably depend a lot on whether or not you were in a city and how late in the century you get. I'm trying to remember the name of it, but there was a very famous house in San Francisco that's got a lot of similarities to Glenview. I mean, by the time you get to the 1870s and 80s, places like San Francisco, particularly, you know, where people got wealthy on railroads and the gold rush, at least the wealthy that would have been making an attempt to follow fashions, not just from the East Coast of the United States, but I probably didn't stress this enough before. Everybody was getting their fashion ideas from London and particularly as the century went on, Paris. A lot of, you know, the considering what was in style and what was admired were fashions from Paris. Earlier on, it had been London. For one reason, people admired Queen Victoria, and when she was younger, people looked to her for as a fashion icon. Then as she got older, and in the 1860s, people looked to Princess Eugénie in the French Second Empire. And then, but then later also they looked to Queen Victoria's daughter-in-law, Alexandra, as a fashion icon. So I think with the railroad connecting the whole United States by the middle of the 1860s, you know, they could get, and the telegraphs too, they could get information, they could get things shipped to them. I have a feeling, but I think that would be definitely wealthier people in cities. I think if you were out in a small town and you were doing a lot of manual work, you know, on a farm and stuff, you would probably not be able to afford, and just for practicality's sake, not be dressed in some of the outfits we've been showing.
Along those lines, actually, probably another question would be, how would garments like this be cleaned?
I have a slide about that. I mean, I think it's been a while since I read up on a lot of this. Anything that could be laundered would be, and that would sometimes even extend to deconstructing things. I have read instructions in household like cyclopedias from the period of literally completely taking something apart to try to take off the washable parts, like wash them and reattach them, or just wash things separately so they wouldn't bleed on each other. But the truth is, and there was probably some rudimentary methods of like dry cleaning, or just like shaking things out or brushing them off, or like spot cleaning things. But the reality was really you tried to keep things from getting gross as much as possible by wearing all the different layers. I mean, the number one damage that you see to costumes that are not in good condition enough to display, or sometimes, you know, not in good enough condition to be collected by a museum, is that the armpits will be literally rotted out, you know, because the sweat from the body not only stained the garment, but started to like cause it to deteriorate. Yeah.
Wow. That's really dramatic. Also, what happened to a bustle when a lady would sit in a chair? That's another question we've gotten.
I think you had to be really careful. I think you had to be more careful in a hoop skirt. You probably had to kind of like, I mean, I've worn tight things that you kind of had to watch how you sat down in them, like shimmy it up a little bit to give yourself more room or something like that. I think you had to be careful. You didn't just lounge around, as I said, like, you know, we do today, especially, you know, in all our meetings at home, like business on top, you know, jammies on the bottom or whatever. You know, you had to pay attention to how you were sitting, and some things were probably easier to sit in than others. So
I've noticed I've seen some bustles that are mostly fabric too, so they'd be kind of almost like pillows.
well, they
Kinda get
were
that.
like, I think some of them were, some of the little ones that were just at the back of you, they also would kind of like, they were made with like wires or even wood. I've seen wood hoops that were held together with ribbons, so they could almost collapse, you know, like sort of like open up, like imagine a slinky almost, you know.
We're actually getting a lot of questions, which is really great. A lot of people are really happy with this talk, so you should know that, Laura.
All right,
Um,
well, we could take a few more, but I also want to be a
Yeah.
little bit conscious of the time because we're about halfway through.
There was a question, would non-white women be allowed to wear the same type of clothing, or did it depend solely on finances or social status?
I can't say that's something I'm really a big expert on. You know, and even like in the Trevor household, all of the servants were white. I think, I mean, a lot of times people might have worn hand-me-down clothes or just not have replaced their clothes as often. So their clothes might not be in the most up-to-date style. Or there just were certain things, if you were working, that would not be practical. But, you know, I've been doing, I was doing actually in preparation for this, some more research about corsets, because I know that in the costume historian community, a lot of ideas about corsets have changed. And one person was saying that they had actually worn a reproduction corset around for a day doing all kinds of different things. And even though it was hard to have mobility, as long as it wasn't laced too tightly, you know, she did all these things you would consider chores, and, you know, lifting things and carrying water. And she even claimed she climbed a tree. But, you know, so I think we might assume that someone who had to work for a living would leave a corset off, either because they couldn't afford it or because the corset was expensive. But I don't know that we can just assume that. But definitely you would wear something simpler, and definitely like having on an apron, that kind of a thing. There were certain things that signified that you were a working person. So.
And probably maybe the last question for this mid-pause, and we'll pause again at the end for more questions. So if your question didn't get answered, just definitely send it again through the chat so I make sure I see it. There was a question about wondering if clothes were mostly purchased from catalogs or if they would be in-person stores in New York City.
That's a good question that I'll be saying a little bit more about in a minute, but not about catalogs. So that's a good question. I mean, there did start to be more ready-made, they called them ready-made clothes in the late 19th century, particularly, and when by that I mean this period. The museum has I think you can probably still get it, a reproduction, like a Dover reproduction of a Bloomingdale's catalog from the late 1880s. And they do have a lot of clothing in there. One thing is the clothing was very tailored. You see how fitted it is. So that was one barrier to there being ready-made clothing. So you started to see a lot of the types of things first available as ready-made clothing that wouldn't have to fit so tightly, like coats or capes or lingerie or that kind of thing. But with those bodices that were so fitted, that made it harder to just say like make it in particular sizes. One, you know, several size fits all. But there did start to be more ready-made clothing. And then there were a lot of dressmakers. There were a lot of design houses. You know, people who were wealthy like the Trevors, they when they went abroad, that was one of the things they would do, was like get clothes. Like when Emily Trevor, the daughter, documented some of her trips abroad, and some of the things she did in London and in Paris were go to couturiers. So, but I am going to be saying a little bit more about that. So
It's probably
should
a perfect
we
segue
go
to get
on
back to, yeah.
to the next slide? Okay, so I mentioned that I want to get into this idea that the Trevors were at Glenview. So if they're at Glenview, you know, what kinds of things are they wearing in their life at Glenview? And certainly they would have nice, you know, outfits that they would wear for going out to visit and for receiving people in the home, you know, for tea or for dinner. And this is, we're fortunate that the Trevor family has a lot of pictures and just treasure troves of negatives that they've been scanning in the last decade or so, because the son, John, who grew up at Glenview, became a really accomplished amateur photographer, and he took both of these pictures. This is Mrs. Trevor on the left. And I love this idea that we're thinking that they're going to go outside at Glenview and maybe have on some sportswear, but here she is in this nice dress. And she pulled one of their nice chairs out on the lawn to photograph her spaniel. And then we have Mary Trevor on the right, and you can see that she's right out in front of Glenview. There used to be a porch, different sort of porch on the front that you could drive a carriage up under. And I love it that they seem like maybe they went to the dressmaker with the same bolt of fabric for their outfits. But instead of having a whole dress on, Mary seems to have decided whether or not there was a matching skirt for what she's wearing. She seems to have on a more simple, probably a wool skirt, which would be more practical if she was going to go out and, you know, do some kind of walking around the grounds at Glenview. And she's actually wearing leather gloves that look fairly substantial. So maybe she's even going to go drive the ponies. They called it driving the ponies, driving the horses. Mr. Trevor bred trotting horses, and Emily would talk quite a bit about going out for a drive with the horses. And then in the center is a dress from our own collection that looks very similar. So, you know, both these have the big 1890s sleeves. And this dress, again, no train on this dress, and probably was for going out and visiting with people. This dress does not have a known maker, the one from the museum's collection. And it shows the stripes. Stripes were very popular. And this dress is shown in a slide from an exhibition that I curated a number of years ago, and I wanted to show some of these slides. This is right before the advent of digital photography, at least at the Hudson River Museum. So I do apologize, these are some old slides, but this show I felt like was a very useful way to interpret our costumes. We talked about all the different types of outfits that women would wear during a day and put them into scenes. And this woman is standing in the parlor. You see a blow up behind her, which is actually Glenview's parlor. And then we would combine this with quotes from Emily's diaries and etiquette books. And I have a few more slides from this show, including in the next slide. So one of the dioramas we set up was out spending time outdoors at Glenview. And we had this picture, which actually we photoshopped two pictures together so we could show the grounds and the Hudson River together with the house. And we showed someone dressed for golf on the left. And in fact, Emily Trevor, the daughter, took golf lessons and went to play golf quite a bit at St. Andrews, which was in Yonkers at the time and was later in Hastings on Hudson. And then she also would go, she was a member of the Ardsley Country Club, which was one of the first country clubs that allowed women members. So she would go golfing there, and she would take some golfing lessons, and she would also go and watch her brothers play golf. And then there's a riding habit there, which is minuscule, I can tell you. This riding habit was from London, from a London tailor, J.B. Hone, and belonged to Mary Trevor. So it's possible that Mary Trevor could have ordered this from New York, but probably I imagine that she would have gone to this tailor when she was over in London at some point. And riding habits were some of the most traditional sportswear for women. They were actually designed for riding side saddle and for draping properly when you were side saddle. So sometimes the skirt was all uneven when you were standing on the ground because it was designed to hang nicely when you were sitting side saddle on the horse. And then we have, one of these large penny farthing bicycles, which were very difficult to ride. And then we have someone out with a baby in a carriage in the background. You can't really see, but in the fashion plate, you notice someone has on a riding habit. And then look at this strange bicycle. It's almost like a tricycle type of contraption. So that seems to be something that would have been designed specifically to be more easily ridden by a woman. And a lot of times you see pictures of women in bloomers that would be riding bicycles, but more often I've seen things like this where they still had on a skirt. It may have had some kind of bloomer under it or something, but it still looked like a skirt, but it was much shorter than a regular skirt, so they could ride the bicycle with it. And we could have the next slide, please. So this is a picture of Emily Trevor taken somewhere inside Glenview, probably by her brother. And she actually became quite an avid bicyclist, I wanted to point out. We don't have any photographs of her in the clothing that she wore. This is an ad by the artist Will Bradley, which is in the collection of the Boston Public Library, for Columbia bicycles in 1895. And actually, in 1895, Emily Trevor bought herself a Columbia bicycle. And you see this, and of course, this very decorative poster is completely not the kind of clothing that I can't even imagine somebody riding a bicycle successfully in that. But what you should notice is that these are what they called safety bikes. And you started to see things called safety bikes in the 1880s, but particularly they made a big deal about displaying these Columbia bicycles at the Columbian Exposition, World's Fair in Chicago. And they were easier and safer to get onto and ride. And in fact, you can track Emily's interest in her diary. First, she says that she was with a bunch of people and they went to go cycling, and that several people participated. So I guess she went with them, but she says that she and her friend just watched them cycling. And then about a few days later, she tries it and she says she only stayed on 5 minutes. Well, then a few days later, she goes and she takes a bicycling lesson. And she took a few bicycling lessons and she talked about how she thought it was fun, but she thought the women looked weird on them. Like, she was sort of joining the modern era, but still maybe it was because of what they were wearing. She just wasn't used to seeing women do that. Nevertheless, she bought herself this bicycle and she bicycled all over the place. She bicycled to downtown Yonkers. She bicycled to Riverdale. She bicycled up to Hastings. Anyway, so she was quite the sportswoman and probably had an outfit to go with that. Next slide, please. So these are not slides of Emily Trevor, but these give you some idea in the period. On the right is a detail of a photograph of the Yonkers Bicycle Club down on Riverdale Avenue somewhere. And again, one of these strange contraptions, this looks like some kind of a duplex bike tricycle thing that's designed to be easier for a woman to ride on. And then on the left is a tintype in the museum's collection, which includes two women. It's a little bit hard to see what they're wearing, but it seems to be skirts. And they've got hats on, to protect themselves from the sun. And I like that this woman on the right, in the picture on the left, the woman on the right, her jacket is open. She's got on a blouse and a jacket that's open. So it's not, by our standards, she's not got a lot of freedom of movement, but compared to some of the fancier earlier outfits a woman might be wearing, she has more freedom of movement. Next slide. So then to go from the other end of being out on your bicycle to being the most dressed up you could possibly be, some of the other information that we get about the Trevor lifestyles through the diaries of Emily Trevor is that she loved to go to the opera. So even when she was at Glenview, she would go down to the city. By the mid 1890s, her mother had bought a house on 38th Street between Madison and Lexington, I think. And so she could go down and stay in the city and go to the opera. She didn't have her own box, but she would go all the time with her friends. The Tiffany family were some of the people that she would go to the opera with. And these clothes did not belong to her, but in that same exhibit I mentioned about dressing for a Victorian day, this was the diorama that I set up with a postcard at the Metropolitan Opera behind these women. This is a ball gown of 1895 with these huge giant pink velvet sleeves. And on the right is a dress from a little bit later, probably around 1900. And what's interesting about that dress is it has another piece you can put in to make it high necked. You call that a dickie, if anybody remembers that term. They used to have even those things when I was a kid, that you would put in something to look like you had on a turtleneck when you really just had on this little collar that was tucked under the rest of your outfit. And this dress comes with a fancy dickie that would make it high necked. And then if you wanted to be a little dressier and have some of your, chest showing for the décolletage, you could take the dickie off, like I have it shown here. And one of the etiquette books of the period says an evening dress should be of as rich material and as elegantly made as can be afforded. The colors should be harmonious. The dress should not be so low in the neck as to excite remark. And then another etiquette book said, the dress may be very elegant for operas consisting of full evening costume, and the hair should be dressed with flowers or ornaments. And it was so much of a fashion parade at the opera that the etiquette books also said that it was rude for you to gaze around the theater with your opera glasses. You should be looking at the opera, not at everybody in the boxes in their outfits. And you notice I have fans in the hands of these mannequins. I won't go into fans a lot, but they were an indispensable article of clothing, partly to keep you from sweating too much in your dress, but also there was an elaborate ritual of fans and their language and different things they meaned. And the size of the fans would also sort of grow and shrink according to the various silhouettes of the period. So probably, larger fans in the 1890s to mimic that large shouldered look. And this is a fashion illustration from Demarest again of fans of the period. And you see these flying cranes on one of these fans, very sort of, there was a lot of Japanese influence of designs for fans, but also you see on this fan on the lower left, sort of an 18th century scene a lot of romanticism for the 18th century. These fans actually belonged to the Trevor family, and these fans were given to us by the grandson of John Bon Trevor. So they probably belonged either to his unmarried aunt, Emily, who wrote the diaries, or to Mrs. Trevor herself. Next slide. So I want to say a little bit now about Mary Trevor, Talmadge Trevor Winthrop. Talmadge was an old colonial name that it would be a whole other lecture of itself. Mrs. Trevor is a name from Mrs. Trevor's side of the family, and one of her ancestors had actually signed the Declaration of Independence, and she was a member of the colonial dames. And so Mary had this middle name. And Mary married a man named Glenview Winthrop, and here's a picture of her with her daughter Kate, who was born in the 1890s. Mary got married in 1892. You see these giant sleeves on her dress. So this is from about 1895, and you can tell that too from the age of Kate. So she's very up to the mode. And then on the right, another formal portrait of Mary. It almost looks like she's wearing a wedding gown, but because it looks like she's got like orange blossoms running up the shoulder. But since she's not wearing a veil or anything in her hair, I don't really think this is a picture of her in her wedding dress, just some other occasion. There were many other occasions where people might wear white. For example, just the other day, one of the Trevor descendants sent me a picture of Carolyn Wilmerding, who married Mr. Trevor's grandson and or son. Anyway, it was a dress that she wore to be presented to the Queen in England in the early 20th century, and it was all white. Or if you were a debutante, you would be dressed in all white. So she might have this dress on for a few reasons. When I had that, the museum had the show Dressing for a Victorian Day, we set up a diorama of a wedding in Yonkers because Mary Trevor did get married at St. John's Church in Yonkers. These are not clothing from her wedding. We don't have those, but I have borrowed and displayed her wedding veil before. It still belongs to the Trevor family. In any case, in the background, you see St. John's, which is a very historic church. It's one of the oldest buildings in Yonkers, but it had been enlarged and renovated in the late 19th century with Tiffany windows, almost at the same time that Glenview was built. And Mrs. Trevor was Episcopalian, and this is where Mary got married. The wedding dress that you actually do see on the right, which was probably at one time more of an ivory color, it was worn by a Jewish bride, actually. And then in the center is a dress that I acquired for the museum's collection, because it had been found wrapped in paper that said it was worn by a bridesmaid in Yonkers. It's not a lot of information to go on. We haven't really tracked down whether we can really figure out, what wedding it was. It said 1894, and the dress was made by someone named Miss Weiss, a dressmaker in Perth Amboy, New Jersey. So next slide, please. So I first, I went up to visit Mary Trevor's descendants in the Berkshires a number of years ago when I was researching her wedding, and they actually donated to the museum quite a number of articles of clothing that had belonged to Mary Trevor, probably right around the time she first got married and was, living in New York City and up in Lenox, Massachusetts. This is a bodice, front and back, very vividly colored. These kinds of colors were not possible before the era of chemical dyes. And so this very elaborate bodice probably had a matching skirt often you don't find the skirt. We have many, many bodices in the museum's collection that don't have their matching skirts anymore because you had a huge bit of fabric that was perfect for making into something else, or you could let it out if you gained a little weight, but the bodice not so easily so because it had all those bones in it and was made of such tiny little pieces of fabric pieced together. So often you find the bodice, but not the skirt. So imagine this with a skirt. And so we were talking about dressmakers. This was made by Mrs. C. Donovan, who I was able to find out was somebody named Catherine Donovan. She was an Irish immigrant and she had a shop on Madison Avenue at 40th Street, which is interesting because that was right around the corner from where Mrs. Trevor bought her house on 38th Street. And several of the costumes that belonged to Mary Trevor were purchased within a block of where she actually lived. And Mrs. Donovan made her own designs, which this may be one of them, but she also imported, oh yeah, you could show the next slide. This is the inside of it, shows the label. She also imported things like by Charles Frederick Worth from Paris. And so she got inspired by these Parisian fashions that she imported. And then she also made her own. I wanted to show this too, again, just to show how extremely elaborate the inside of some of these dresses are. I mean, look at the way the seams are stitched, you know, all around the edges of them, the bones all stitched in so carefully. And then these sort of ruffles are probably an attempt to sort of pad out, you know, parts of the dress where they want a smooth line. If you go to the next slide, I have another bodice by hers. This is one of my favorite objects in the entire collection. And it probably, and again, you've got this little bit of interest at the shoulders. So this might have been either before she got married, or it could also be later, you know, but I have a feeling this is like early 1890s. And just so much detail and this asymmetrical detail of this row of these, this is cut steel. They would make a lot of details and even jewelry out of cut steel. It was shiny and they would facet it almost like it was, you know, cubic zirconia or something, but it would just be steel, but it would sparkle. And that's what all of these little details are made out of. And so I showed you a few different, you know, pictures of the cuffs, front and back. The back had these little tails. It's just so elaborate. This is made by someone named Celeste Dautricourt, who was a French background, a dressmaker, and she was at 3 East 35th Street. And this, we also no longer, we were not given a skirt, but it probably did have a matching skirt. And here's the inside of this with all the boning and in excellent condition. And look at those tiny little hand stitches finishing off the edge of where it was cut. And you see the label. Next slide. And we have a lot of her lingerie too. And this has Mary Trevor Winthrop, you know, cross-stitched into the top of the stocking. And most women for everyday wear would have on black stockings. You saw also even in the bathing suit, black stockings and black, you know, lace up or button up boots. Then if you were more dressed up, that's when you would wear some other kind of shoes or some other color of stockings. And the reason for we talked about laundry, the reason for Mary Trevor to have her name on her stockings up at the top of the thigh where nobody would see it was because of laundry. So if you had servants doing your laundry, or even if you had several people in your family and you were doing your own laundry, and everybody, literally every woman in the house had black stockings, you had to be able to tell them apart. It's like, you know, when men send their shirts to the cleaners, at least in the old days, to be laundered, usually there's some kind of mark in the collar somewhere, you know, so that they can figure out which shirt was yours. Next slide, please. And we are other items that we have that belong to Mary Trevor are these wonderful satin shoes, again with some, it might be glass, but I think it's probably cut steel decoration, or it could be glass beads. They would coat the inside with silver, and then over the years they tarnish and they start to look a little less sparkly. And then these gloves are made by, or they are marked Jams, J-A-M-M-E-S, Jam, which is A.F. Jam, who had a shop in New York City, and he imported gloves made by Jean Frère in Paris. So probably he was, you know, just a member of the family sent over to be a liaison in New York City. And next slide. And then again, more things that belonged to Mary Trevor. This is one of my favorites. She had these pale pink shoes, and they are fairly pale. I hope that you can see that they're pink in this picture. And then pale pink stockings to match the pale pink shoes with this wonderful, I think they call this the clock, the area of, you know, see how practical that is. They're only bothering to decorate with special kind of weaving the area of the stocking that might be seen. Of course, above the ankle, it's not going to be seen, and it doesn't have to be decorated. And then this is an ad from the period for shoes, just to show you that this style of heel, which they called a Louis heel, because it was a throwback to you know, France in previous centuries during the royalty of the Louis. There was a lot of throwbacks to details of 18th century fashion in the 19th century, even as far back as the 1870s. Often it's just taking bits and pieces from things that were popular at the time, so that you would never look at that thing and automatically say, oh, that person looks like they're dressed in 18th century dress or 17th century dress, because it's just, you know, a particular type of over sort of skirt, but it looks very different the way they've interpreted it. And the same with these kinds of shoes. This heel was very popular. Next slide, please. And then we have a few hats that belong to Mary. And this is one of my favorites, with this draped lace and this big velvet bow. Everyone that knows me knows I love velvet and wear it all the time. And this was from the Liechtenstein millinery company. And you see in the label, it says Paris, London, and New York. And indeed, Liechtenstein had a shop on 30th Street between 5th and Broadway. I was able, through the magic of the internet, to find a sort of a notice of somebody pointing out when they first opened their location there, and how beautiful all the things in the window were, and that it was a rival with any, you know, finest millinery shop they'd ever seen. So again, not very far from where the Trevor, you know, I mean, Mary, once she was married, was not full-time in New York City, and her own house was on the Upper East Side, but not far from where her mother was living. Okay, next slide. Finally, to the scene people were asking about before. We wanted to, when we were showing about, you know, how people dressed throughout the day in the 1890s, we didn't want to forget that a lifestyle like the Trevors is impossible without a lot of people working for them and taking care of things like their laundry. So we wanted to set up a diorama showing this. At one point in the censuses, the Trevor family had about 11 servants working for them. And I think that did not count the fact that the gardener had a whole household down at the south end of the property. So here we have two women dressed in costumes that had been lent to us by other museums and historical societies. The aprons belonged to the Hudson River Museum. And so that is, you know, a sign of them, one sign of them being a working class. And also they would have on cotton dresses, you know, so that would be one thing somebody asked, like, you know, what kind of dress would you have on? You might have on a dress that was in the basic silhouette of the, you know, the fashionable style. But if you were working and you were going to need to launder this dress, much more likely it would be made of cotton and not of satin or some other kind of silk. And so here they are, you know, ironing. You can't really see, but the woman in the red dress has an iron in her hand. Of course, you had to put the iron on the stove to heat it up. It wasn't electric or anything. And you might have several of them sitting there, you know, so that when one got cold, you picked up another one. And the picture in the background was from the collection of the Museum of the City of New York, showing laundresses at work. Next slide. So I mentioned cotton and linen clothing being easier to wash. And again, we're thinking about the Trevors living out in the countryside and being involved in active, you know, sports outside and things. One of the changes you really see in the 1890s for sportswear and also for working women, which is obviously not the Trevors, but working women, was this idea of wearing separates. We saw Mary Trevor out in the yard with a bodice that was probably made from for a dress, but she was wearing it with a simpler, more practical skirt. So wearing a blouse and a skirt was a much more practical for a lot of reasons, if only for the fact that you could wash the blouse. Also in certain weather, the blouse would be so much more comfortable. And so you see a lot more outfits that are either an entire dress made of cotton that can be washed, or a blouse and a skirt. These are some women, unfortunately, we don't know who they were, but they were middle-class women in Yonkers, a gift of glass plate negatives from a Yonkers photographer. And you see that they are wearing skirts and a skirt and a blouse, and it might be a skirt and a blouse here or a whole dress made of cotton. Next slide. Oh, and this blouse belonged to Mary Trevor. So the next few blouses I'm showing, they belonged to Mary Trevor. So she also herself had these practical garments, although look how fancy. I love this one. It's purple and white stripes. And also just all the details on it. The next slide is some of these details. You see the care taken in the little detail at the cuff, the care in matching up the stripes. The shoulder has a little extra detail. And then a lot of times you see these ties at the back of the blouses to help gather them together at the front and keep them tucked in nicely. And we have another one in the next slide, this sort of peach colored or rose colored. And again, look at the lining up of the stripes there on the back. And again, you have the tie and all the little details that go into it. So we're getting to the final stretch here, and it's close to 3 o'clock. So I'll rush through. This next slide, if you go past the 1900s, this dress did not belong to the Trevors, but I couldn't resist showing it. It's probably from the very early, right around 1900. And it is the one that's been the background of all my title slides the whole time, is this dress. And again, this dress, the other dress I showed that had the separate dicky, this dress instead has 2 entire bodices, because dresses, you know, were expensive and you wanted to get all the wear you could out of them. So the woman who owned this dress had 2 entirely separate bodices. One that was lower cut with shorter sleeves, you know, for dinner or, you know, going out to be a little dressier. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see some more details of this other, the bodice with the high neck, just so many details. And you start to see this kind of busy frilliness around the bodice in the early 20th century. And part of the influence, I think, of the blouses is that this kind of, you know, how like when sometimes it's popular to have your blouse sort of poofed out a little bit instead of tucked in completely, or even if you want it tucked in tightly, after a while, it kind of poofs out. That style sort of bled over into other kinds of garments. And they called it like the powder pigeon effect was one of the words for it. And you start to see this kind of puffiness down by the waist of the bodices, and also all these very soft and frilly fabrics decorating them, and things that have a lot of puffiness and softness to them, and see the soft drapey fabric that the skirt's made of, and it has that tulip effect. And then one thing you see happening with the sleeves that you can see on these sleeves, if you go back for a second, is the sleeves are not puffy at the top or in the middle. They're sort of drooping down toward the sort of belling out toward the wrist. You see that for a while in the early 20th century. And then if you skip to slide 54, one of the scenarios I set up in the exhibition we did was somebody visiting the dressmaker. And I used this dress because it was that it had so many pieces. I had one on the dressmaker's model. I had one of the bodices. I had another one on the pretending it was about to be sewn on the sewing machine. And I had the lady in her very simple silk dress with her tape measure, and the woman looking in the mirror with her corset, with her under corset chemise and the corset, and trying on the skirt. And because even though a lot of the very famous designers in France, like Charles Frederick Worth, or later, Poiret, are men, a lot of the people were really dressmakers, and they might be a fancy dressmaker or a simple dressmaker, depending on what you could afford. But a lot of this work was done by women. And you could either have them design something for you, or you might even, after a while, order a pattern through the mail. Like Butterick, I believe, is one of those really, really old pattern companies. Maybe you would bring the pattern to the dressmaker. Just a few more slides. This is a society portrait by James Debussy Shannon, a contemporary of John Singer Sargent, and it's Mrs. Samuel Untermeyer. So once, you're all dressed up and you're a very, wealthy Gilded Age society woman, you would want to have your portrait made in your fancy clothing. So here we see, this is Minnie Carl, who married Samuel Untermeyer, and they lived up where the Untermeyer Gardens are now. The house isn't standing anymore. And it is painted in this early 20th century period. And you see this sort of like, not only are the sleeves kind of falling down, they're like literally falling down like off the shoulder, but you also have this real softness and all this decoration around the bodice. She's got some very simple jewelry on. And you start to see this, what they started to call a Gibson girl hairstyle, which is this very soft, poofy sort of bun, whereas a lot of the styles in the 19th century, you couldn't really see them under their hats, but they were much more tight buns. And if you show the next slide, so the Trevor women also had society portraits like these made. James Debussy Shannon, though American, lived over in London, and but other society portraitists would come from Europe besides him to paint people in the United States. And one of them was Raimundo de Madrazo from Spain. And he visited New York and painted both of the Trevor daughters, Mary on the left and Emily on the right. These paintings still belong to the Trevor family. And he had a show of his portraits of New York's society women at a gallery, the Ohm Gallery in New York City. And that is, a newspaper article from Emily Trevor's scrapbook of the time that their portraits were featured in this art gallery show in New York City in their fine gowns. Definitely a lot of sort of lace and décolletage, and you see on Mary this kind of sleeves that end at the elbow with a lot of lace, just like Mrs. Untermeyer had on. Next slide, please. So coming around full circle to the end of the fact that they're up at Glenview out of doors. So these two wonderful pictures we have from the early 20th century of the Trevor family at Glenview. I just love that Emily brought her nieces out in the yard with a big, expensive carpet used as a picnic blanket. You see her large hat on the blanket to protect her from the sun. She is wearing a fairly, modest wool garment. And then up on the porch, there she is with Mrs. Trevor, with her brother-in-law, and again with that is Emily, I believe, and the younger daughter is Kate in the other picture. If you go to the next slide, though, we'll get back to what I was talking about a minute ago with more and more of a popularity of women to wear cooler dresses outside. I mean, we don't know what time of year that was, but these kinds of dresses, they would call them lingerie dresses. At least they've come to be called lingerie dresses because they are made out of what lingerie and petticoats were made out of, cotton or linen, with a lot of the same eyelet and lace and embroidery details you would find on women's undergarments, but now made into a dress, which was much cooler and much easier to launder than other kinds of garments. So you see this woman on Le Miroir de Mode, a French fashion journal, outside with her daughters or nieces having a picnic, and another fashion plate on the left similarly. And you see that kind of powder pigeon silhouette and the skirt that goes straight down and then kind of billows out softly. And then on the right, this is a dress in the museum's collection that belonged to Mrs. Henry Trevor, Mr. Trevor's elder son's wife, who was Margaret Schifflin. And in the 1950s, the family gave us this dress, lingerie dress that had been worn by her. In the next slide, you see it as part of a display. You see how popular these dresses were. The museum has several in the collection. This was a small display we did one time, and all of them made by cotton except the one in the center, which is a type of sort of gauzy silk. And again, the one on the right being the one that belonged to Margaret Trevor. And then I have one more slide, which is the latest of the slides. This was probably more like 1910, 1915, two more pictures that belong to the family. And you see Mrs. Trevor at the top is looking a little bit more old-fashioned, wearing her old silk dress outside, maybe not even quite up to the mode. And then Emily on the right, and I believe it's one of the daughter-in-laws on the left, in these linen suits. So they are dressed up in these suits, which are made of a breathable fabric, and they look very professional. You could also often imagine them like marching in a suffragette parade or something, and in these very, very large hats that were popular during the period. And so anyway, this brings us up to pretty much the end of the period that the Trevors were living at Glenview, and you can see how much the fashions changed from start to finish. Do we have any more questions?
Just a few more. One of them was how much a dress would potentially cost. I know it would change depending on the period, but do we have any kind of information on if we kind of know any kind of pricing?
I did not look into that now. I think we know how much this corset cost. I think the price is right on it, which would maybe give you some idea. They can be up to $15 just for this corset. I mean, one thing I do know that I have heard said a lot of times is that people owned much fewer clothing than we do today in sort of our era of disposable, clothing, and that it was a much higher percentage of their annual budget. Proportionately, it was very expensive compared to most of the clothing that we buy today. But I imagine it ran the gamut. You know, some of these really wealthy people's clothing had actual gold embroidery on it. So there was probably just as much of a range of prices as there is today between going to the Target or going over to, you know, Givenchy or, you know, some designer place in Paris and spending tens of thousands of dollars on something.
Another question just came in saying, how many times a day would they change clothes?
I think it could be as many as 5. I mean, if you got up in the morning, and I guess you could count or not count your, you know, your bedwear, and then you're going to put on something, maybe you're going to put on something to wear around in the morning. But then if you want to go out on to visit some people, maybe you want to wear more of a walking costume, or depending on like how you're getting where you're going, are you walking or you're going in the carriage? So that could be 2 things. Then if you were going to participate in a sport of some sort, you would change to that outfit. And then you might change for dinner, and you weren't really supposed to have a lot of décolletage at dinner, as in like showing your chest off. So then you might change again to go to the opera or some other kind of ball. So I would say up to 5 times.
Yeah, crazy, very impressive, really. Someone was also, I know you mentioned it, but just to reiterate it, where was Mary's Upper East Side house?
You know, I only found out the other day. It wasn't something I had, I think it was on 80th. I was wondering, I've never gone and walked past that one. It made me want to do that, see if it was still there. You know, the house on 38th Street is still there. It's privately owned though, so nobody go up, and I'm not going to tell you the exact address so you won't go up and knock on the door. Anything else?
I think the last question that just kind of came in was that someone was wondering if the harem look of much shorter hemlines came into fashion before the 1920s.
Yes. Are you talking about, if you go back to slide 10, if Olivia wants to do that, that was the dress with the peacocks on it. Something like that would be very influenced by the Ballet Russe and Poiret in Paris. And I would say things like that were very influenced by that type of look. And you're talking like I think 1912, I think was when Nijinsky debuted in Afternoon of a Faun. And there were some actual harem pant looks. I think, I apologize if people hear my cat in the background. But I think you would have probably been an adventurous, sort of radical, you know, woman to be wearing one of those outfits, just like some of the things you see on the runway today don't really make it onto many real people. I actually, on this slide, there's a quote that I had wanted to say about men's clothing. I mean, mostly the reason that this talk is just about women is to talk about men too, would make it way too long. And we know more about what the Trevor women wore, but also women's clothing was more, was more fancy. And this is the quote from one of the etiquette books. "A gentleman shall always be so well dressed that his dress shall never be observed at all. The toilette is the domain of the fair sex. Let a wise man seek to be himself appreciated for something of higher worth." And we could have a whole other lecture about what's maddening about that quote, but there was like less drama during this era in men's clothing.
That's about it. I think, well, especially given time.
I thank you everyone for staying such a long time. It was a big topic, and thank you for listening. The next one is going to be in June and will be about Daniel Pabst and the woodwork of Glenview. Shall we say goodbye? Okay.
All right.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you guys for coming. You guys can send your questions and comments that haven't yet been answered to curatorial@hrm.org. We like to thank all of you guys for coming and for watching. It's what keeps us going and our programming alive. So we always appreciate that. And you guys have a great rest of your Sunday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great.